University School of Foreign Service. As a practitioner, Dr. Miller served as director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff, worked as an intel analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, and served as a military officer in the United States Army. He's been published. He's got 3 books. First being The American Power and Liberal Order, a conservative internationalist grand strategy. And another book is Armed State Building. And most recently, and in perfect timing for our colloquium, is Just War and Ordered Liberty. He has previously taught at the University of Texas at Austin and at the National Defense University, and has worked at the Rand Corporation prior to his arrival at Georgetown. He holds a PhD in international relations and a BA in government from Georgetown University and a Master of Public Policy from the Kennedy School at Harvard. His expertise is in international relations, national security, military, war and peace, political theory, religion, security studies, and strategy. And the floor is yours, sir.
David, thank you so much for the introduction. And let me also say thank you to Wheaton College and to the Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics for hosting me at this event. I understand that you all have enjoyed a day of discussion about just war. I'm honored to present some of my work, which will hopefully be a good complement to the discussions you've been having. I'm especially grateful to Wheaton because I published my book right in the middle of a pandemic, and there was not a whole lot of events around. So this is my first opportunity to really share this. And so I'm especially grateful to you, David, and to Wheaton for giving me this opportunity. And also thank you to Luke Perez, if you're out there. I know you presented today. Luke is the one who actually encouraged me some years ago to actually sit down and finally write this book that I've been talking about for many years. So thanks to Luke for that. And last, thanks to you all who are watching and listening to this. We live in a year of too much Zoom, and here you are voluntarily giving an hour of your time to more Zoom. So I hope to make it worth your time. And with that, we'll kick it off. Why does this matter? This topic of just war. Why does it matter, particularly to civilians and to students, undergraduate and graduate students? This is obviously important to soldiers. I saw on the participants list there, Wheaton ROTC, so important for you guys. And it's important to national security decision makers. But I assume that probably does not describe most of you listening in on this. I think it's important because we are all interested in justice. We all should be. Every citizen is or should be interested in justice. And I assume that all the students listening into this believe that justice is important. And probably many of you all have your own particular issue that you're passionate about in which you want to see justice done. But what is justice? We have a lot of different definitions of it and plenty of disagreement about what justice truly is. I think the study of war can be especially helpful because it's the hard case. It's where it's hardest to see justice. If you can find justice in war, then justice will stand out in sharper relief, and you will be able to see it more clearly and apply it in the rest of policy issues more readily. Just war is an argument about the nature and purpose of government, as illustrated by the use of government's most distinctive instrument, lethal force. That means it's a discussion that requires us to understand pardon the expression, the telos of sovereignty, the telos, the rightful meaning, the rightful purpose, the fulfillment, or the intention behind government's existence and behind state power. It clarifies the nature of justice. It clarifies the purpose of the state and the content of the natural law. And that should help us apply justice more carefully elsewhere. How we define justice in one field affects how we should define and pursue justice in all fields. So that, I hope, helps you kind of set the table for why this is important, even if you're not involved in national security affairs. As I studied this issue, I found that the definitions of justice and natural law and sovereignty changed over time. Just in the way that Alasdair MacIntyre said in his groundbreaking work on After Virtue, as the world moved from pre-modern to modern to postmodern, That, of course, was accompanied by shifts in understandings about justice, sovereignty, natural law, and consequently, understandings of war and just war as well. That means it's not a simple, I can't give you a simple answer if you ask me what is just war or what is justice in war. I have to tell you a story of how these concepts have changed over time. And broadly, I found where I categorize these different understandings in three traditions. The Augustinian tradition, where I'm going to spend most of my time tonight, what I've called the Westphalian tradition, that's the kind of early modern tradition, or the Enlightenment tradition. And lastly, the liberal tradition that we are living through right now. The Augustinian tradition of just war thinking is broadly what I would characterize as the Christian church's traditional doctrine of civil government and war. It is a theological school of thought, as opposed to the later ones, which are secular, legal. And it starts with the idea that states should be guided by natural law. Natural law is the moral order inherent in creation, accessible by a rightly formed intellect, and applicable across time and culture. Natural law is universally binding moral rules that we get from nature, not exclusively from revelation or from scripture. States should be guided by natural law, according to this tradition. And what we learn as we consult the natural law, and by the way, as we consult scripture, is that the goal of statecraft, the goal of government itself, is, of course, justice and peace. These two virtues together are the cardinal virtues of political life. Now you might be thinking, no duh, tell me something I don't know. I'm going to unpack a bit more what that means as we go on, what justice really means in this tradition. But I do want to stress that justice and peace need to go together in this tradition. Augustine defined this, he coined a phrase, he said this was the tranquility of order, the tranquilitas ordinus. This is a state of being for all of society in which justice and peace exist in harmony together. It's kind of what I think Abraham Lincoln was getting at when he talked about a just and lasting peace, he said, among nations. I would say a just and lasting peace within and among nations. That's the chief goal, the end purpose for which government exists, is to create that just and lasting peace. And so if that's what we learn from natural law and from scripture, we can say then that sovereignty, the purpose of government, exists to care for the common good. Sovereignty is ultimate responsibility, not simply ultimate power, which is what the Westphalians will say, but ultimate responsibility for providing for the common good. The state exists to foster and uphold the conditions required for the flourishing of the common good. That in turn is a good working definition of justice. I want to unpack this because it may sound a little bit counterintuitive the way the Augustinians sort of argue or the way they define justice. You've probably heard the definition that justice is rendering to each his due. It's a classic definition. You'll find it in Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. And that's true, but the way Aquinas in particular defines this is really, really interesting. He says it's not merely our legal due, like our rights, protecting our rights from criminal intent, but it is also essentially our moral due as creatures made in the image of God. The way Aquinas treats this is that he says that, for example, helping the poor to Aquinas is an act of justice, not merely an act of charity or magnanimity. What do I mean, and why is this important? Nobody deserves the indignity of poverty. We all deserve, just by dint of being creatures made in God's image, we deserve the conditions that could enable our flourishing. That's what Aquinas thinks is justice. And so if we help the poor out of the kindness of our hearts, that's actually an act of justice. Helping others achieve flourishing is justice in this tradition. And again, that might sound a bit counterintuitive to our ears since we're accustomed to separating justice from charity or justice from magnanimity. This has profound consequences for how we think about war. If this is what justice means abstractly, then what does it mean to accomplish justice in war? It means that the state uses lethal force to accomplish justice, as we've just defined it, justice and peace in defense of the common good. And again, in this understanding, justice is not primarily or exclusively about self-defense, although it does include self-defense. It means defending the principles of justice and peace, defined as the common good for all, the conditions of flourishing for all. Now, in Augustine himself, this is a little vague. All he says is that war is a response to an injury received. He doesn't go much further than that. But by the time we get sort of post-Aquinas, the theologians of that era, here we're talking about Alberico Gentili and Francisco Suarez, Francisco de Vitoria, they are very explicit. When they say that we should defend the common good whose defense we are charged to defend is not limited to ourselves, is not limited to our immediate neighbors, and it is not even limited necessarily to our own kingdom or our own country. In principle, it could be the common good of all humanity. Again, Gentili was very clear about that. That means, in principle, we could defend justice and peace abroad, outside of our borders, if and when no one else can or will. On these grounds, the Augustinian theologians very clearly, very explicitly endorsed and favored the justice of war against tyrants, pirates, cannibals, violators of natural law, as well as international aggressors, of course. That is to say, everything that we today call humanitarian intervention was very much clearly part of the Augustinian tradition. I just want to emphasize this because I was surprised when I read these theologians' 500-year-old stuff, very clearly, very explicitly endorsing what we call humanitarian intervention. And I would say it was strong enough to be a pretty strong consensus among both Protestant and Catholic thinkers in the 16th and 17th centuries. That is to say, thinkers in the just war tradition. So if that's the Augustinian tradition, we have to ask ourselves, how did it change and why? And that moves us into the next tradition, the Westphalian tradition. Of course, the wars of religion happened and ended the effort to construct a unified public consensus on the basis of religion in Europe. The Augustinian framework, with its Christian theistic assumptions about natural law, about the moral due to humanity, about charity encompassed within justice, all of that faded away in the post-Westphalian framework. And so just war discourse after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 comes to be dominated more by lawyers, jurists, and philosophers rather than theologians. And they no longer cite Augustine. I combed the footnotes and I found that Pufendorf and Christian von Wolff and others, they just stopped citing Augustine. They don't quote him. They don't put him in the footnotes. Instead, they put Thomas Hobbes, right? He's the new founder of this kind of way of thinking. And so taking its cue from the Enlightenment, in this understanding, natural law isn't what Thomas Aquinas thought it was. They say natural law is more descriptive. It is no longer teleological. Natural law is nothing more than the survival of the fittest. It is the law of the jungle. It's the law of self-preservation. That's what natural law becomes to this new crop of thinkers. In that way of thinking, sovereignty now means ultimate power, not ultimate responsibility. You see, there's a pretty important shift there. States or princes, as they say, princes or governments exist as the ultimate power within their sphere of autonomy, not the ultimate responsible authority to promote the common good or common flourishing. And so justice in this frame looks only like sort of procedural justice, the defense of rights against infringement. And when we talk about war, it's the defense of state rights, not human rights, right? That comes much later. And so the just cause for war is nothing more than national self-defense, not the defense of the common good more broadly conceived, not the defense of abstract principles of justice or peace. In this way of thinking, the ultimate crime is crossing borders with armed force. And you can see how things have changed pretty dramatically. Previously, you could cross borders with armed force to, for example, punish cannibals or tyrants or pirates. And here, you could justly defend against such an intervention because the ultimate crime is crossing borders with the military. This way of thinking about war and justice predominated from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, pretty much all the way through the end of World War II, 1945. It's also more or less the version of just war thinking that was enshrined in international law. As international law gradually crystallized and took more written form, particularly in the 19th century, it tended to harden the idea of international borders as absolutely sacrosanct. It tended to enshrine the principle of non-interference among states and sovereign autonomy as foundational principles of international order. And again, the Augustinian tradition didn't treat those principles as quite so sacrosanct, as quite so inviolable. They were, I would say, maybe more negotiable along with the higher principles of justice and peace. Of course, World War II was a catastrophe for the world and caused many thinkers to rethink some of the assumptions we'd had since Westphalia. And they believed that World War II demonstrated the weaknesses of that approach, particularly the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity seemed to show that sovereignty as ultimate power and autonomy perhaps had gone too far. And so since 1945, we've seen the rise of a third school of thought, a third tradition of just war thinking that has tried to amend or revise the Westphalian settlement to make more room for the defense of individual human rights. And that is the hallmark of what I'm calling the liberal tradition. These thinkers, by and large, argued that sovereignty was not meant to or should not be allowed to be used as a shield behind which tyrants could get away with any monstrosity they wanted, so long as they didn't cross borders doing it, right? And that's essentially what sovereignty had become. And so, again, this liberal just war tradition arose, rooted in the defense and vindication of human rights. This is still very much a new and embryonic tradition in flux. There's clear disagreements between different proponents of it. For example, Paul Ramsey, who's a Protestant theologian on the one hand, and Michael Walzer, who's a secular philosopher on the other. Chances are, if you're a student and you're interested in just war and you've taken a class, you've almost certainly read Michael Walzer. His book is the most popular book on just war. You'll find it on almost every syllabi of a class taught on just war for the last 40 years. His book has been in print continuously since 1977. So most people who have any encounter with just war, they know Michael Walzer. I just want to say right here that his book is good in many respects. It is not representative of the broader just war traditions. I'd say that it's representative of the transition between the Westphalian tradition and the liberal tradition. That's what it's representative of, but not more. Again, there's other representatives in the liberal tradition. The American Catholic bishops in their letter in 1983, I think, showed some inclination in this direction. They emphasized the importance of human rights and others. I would note that there are, I think, some clear parallels between the Augustinian tradition and the liberal tradition. The parallel that I see is that both of them insist that there are limits to the state's jurisdiction, that there are indeed objective external principles or authorities to which the state is accountable. In the Augustinians, it is nature and scripture, and for the liberals, it is human rights, right? They both think there's something outside of the state that holds the state accountable and to which the state must pay heed. That similarity has led me to suggest a kind of Augustinian liberalism. I'm not claiming that Augustine was a liberal, I'm not saying that, but I do want to kind of meld these traditions together insofar as they can be made to fit in a form of, call it Christian democracy, or again, Augustinian liberalism. And can we use this framework, a kind of Augustinian liberalism, to think through our contemporary security challenges from that tradition of just war thought, or those two traditions fit together. So that's what I'd like to do right now as I conclude my discussion and open it up for Q&A here in about 10 minutes, is I want to offer a few thoughts of my own on our contemporary security challenges, drawn from a kind of Augustinian liberal framework, drawing from what I hope is the best of both of these traditions, while of course acknowledging the importance of the Westphalian settlement as well. And I'll address three issues: terrorism, cyber conflict, and artificial intelligence. And I want to conclude with some comments on great power competition and great power war. So first, terrorism. How do we justly combat terrorist groups? From an Augustinian liberal perspective, I think the first thing I'd say is that killing bad guys is not enough. That's not what a just war looks like in an Augustinian liberal framework. Again, drawing from what Augustine said about war, war ought to build a better peace. War ought to exist to push forward the state's mission of upholding the conditions of flourishing for all, which looks like justice and peace for everyone. Whacking bad guys doesn't do that, right? It's necessary. It's a necessary first step, but then you have to take the next step. Here I'd point to the work of Eric Patterson, Brian Arend, who have written extensively about the justice necessary after war, use post bellum. That I think is actually it flows very naturally from the Augustinian tradition. If you're fighting for the principles of justice and peace, you're going to stick around and help build the conditions of justice and peace after the shooting stops. Or for counterinsurgencies and counter-terrorist operations, sometimes while the shooting is still going on. What I'm saying is we have to work for a lasting justice and a lasting peace in, with, and through, and after the fighting. That means, I think, more attention to root causes, more willingness to engage in the messy work of reconstruction, stabilization, stability operations, state building, even I'll say, yes, nation building, and I would say as well, ideological conflict. That is to say, terrorists have their worldviews, call it jihadism for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I think it's an important part of just war is to combat those ideas with better ideas, which look like the ideas of democracy and human rights and liberalism. So I look at Afghanistan today, where I spent 10 years of my career, and I look at the people who have complained that we're fighting, quote, endless wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. And my observation is endless war is a feature, not a bug, of the strategy we have chosen to fight in these countries. We have deliberately chosen, wrongly, I think, to fight a war where we're just killing bad guys and not trying to do much else. In Afghanistan, we tried some state building briefly for a short season between about 2007 and 2011. That was it. Since then, we haven't been trying that at all. So I'm not surprised the war has not stopped. We're not even really trying to stop or win that war. We're just marking time. We're playing for a stalemate. Happy to talk more in the Q&A about the particulars there, but I think the strategy we have chosen in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, in that region, is not a strategy geared towards building lasting justice and peace. It is a strategy only designed to whack some bad guys, keep the pressure on, and hope nothing bad happens. And I think that is strategically unsound. I think it's also unjust. So that's my thoughts on terrorism. That's, I think, how the Augustinian liberal framework would address, again, the problem of terrorism. Cyber conflict and artificial intelligence. I'll do this very quickly. I know you had a whole panel on cyber conflict earlier today. I look forward to going through those papers when I have time. I just want to say very quickly that every time new tools come around, people say, oh, what are the moral implications of these new tools, whether it's nuclear weapons or artificially intelligent machines or the crossbow in the 13th century. And I would just say that new tools never change the moral nature of warfare. They never change our obligation to work for justice and peace. And every new tool must be used with discrimination and proportionality. So there's kind of not a whole lot new to say there. I think the newness of cyber tools and AI is that it may raise questions of right authority, which I haven't talked about yet so far, but I think if you're familiar with just war, you know that war must be vested solely within the hands of the sovereign authority, the prince, the king, the government, the president. They are the ones legitimately authorized to wield the tool of war. Cyber tools today are quite often used by non-state and quasi-state actors. I'm thinking of the hacktivist collective Anonymous, which is essentially a vigilante group using hacker tools to take down people they don't like. And I'm thinking of the quasi-Russian state sponsored or not sponsored groups that do all the bad stuff we accuse Russia of doing. And now I also think about artificially intelligent machines that are capable of making autonomous decisions. In different ways, these things may threaten the principle of right authority. I would say for AI, I can understand ways in which an AI could be used, could be given delegated authority by a commander. I would just always want to make sure there's a human in the decision loop somewhere. I think that's actually really important for maintaining just control over machines, is that there's a human with moral agency who's in command of that machine before pushing the go button, so to speak. So I think it's a key task for just war thinkers to spell out exactly what these boundaries look like in the future. Let me conclude with just a few notes on great power competition and the possibility of great power war. You have likely heard that we're in a new age of great power competition between the United States and China and a resurgent Russia. Perhaps people will say that Europe is now a participant, and India and Japan. I think this is descriptively true that great powers are indeed competing for power and influence in the world. I actually don't think it's new. It's not a new era. I think it never stopped. I think the Cold War ended one particular chapter of great power competition, and that it just kept on going throughout the 90s and on through today. But it doesn't really matter if you agree or disagree on that. It is certainly true that the great powers are competing today for power and influence in ways that could involve a militarized crisis or even a war. So do we just root for America? I want to suggest that American power and American prestige is not self-justifying. It is not intrinsically good just because it's America. Again, the Augustinian framework is helpful here for reminding us that the paramount virtues are justice and peace, not necessarily the success of any one particular nation. If we Christians want to have a dog in this fight, if we want to root for one America versus China or the other way around, it has to be because that power stands for something, stands for justice and peace. If America does not stand for justice and peace, order and liberty, then its competition for power and prestige against Russia and China is an amoral conflict in which Christians have no particular interest and no particular loyalties. It is only if and insofar as the United States and its allies in the free world stand for ordered liberty within and among nations that there's a moral dimension to great power conflict that we as Christians can say we want one side to win and one side to lose. So what I'm saying is the liberal international order, or maybe I should say some version of a liberal international order, is a framework of ordered liberty among nations, a framework of just peace within and among nations. Building, sustaining, and defending that order is a defensible goal of a just grand strategy. And here you should hear me extending the just war framework to cover grand strategy as a whole. And I think that's entirely justified. We should aspire to and even demand that our governments foster justice in, with, and through their foreign policies and their grand strategies. And so again, I just want to say, I think that we should seek for a liberal international order, the defense of which is a good goal of a just grand strategy. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for your excellent remarks. I do have a question queued up here from Keith Pavlicek. Here it is. Great talk. One clarification. Did I understand you to say that Paul Ramsey was a representative of the liberal tradition? Didn't Ramsey understand his own work as being firmly lodged within the broad Augustinian Thomistic tradition and insisted that the just war idea was not merely a feature of Roman Catholicism, but also of various strains of Protestantism?
So Paul Ramsey is a great example of an Augustinian liberal, honestly. I think he's a theologian. He's clearly working within the Augustinian framework. As a Protestant, he is trying to appropriate some of that language Interestingly, he does not like the language of natural law because he thinks natural law is a Catholic thing. And so he kind of rejects that, which I think is a mistake. Is he a liberal? I think he also is liberal. You can find it in the ways he talks about American power and the use of American power around the world, fostering a culture or a climate of freedom among nations, and the way he talks about the war in Vietnam. At one point, he does say something to the effect that the war in Vietnam could only be justified insofar as it helps defeat communist totalitarianism and makes room for freedom for the South Vietnamese, right? That I think is a small example of where you see that classical liberalism popping up in Ramsey's thought. It's a very different kind of liberalism than we see in Walzer and in the Catholic bishops and so forth, but I do think it's fair to put him in that tradition, 1 foot in liberal and kind of 1 foot in the Augustinian tradition.
So my next question is this. When looking at the war in Afghanistan, it is extremely important that we have these stability operations along with the shooting aspect of the war. However, the general public tends to be drawn to seeing a body count rather than seeing how many people are helped when finding support for a war. Most people oppose supporting stability operations because of the cost. What is a possible way to gain support from the public on providing support despite the costs?
So I actually think that that may be too cynical, which is amazing coming from me because I'm a natural pessimist. Um, I, I find that if you talk to people about the moral dimension of war, my students at least, they do tend to resonate with that. So if you tell them that you can try to sell the war in Afghanistan on strategic calculus, we need to kill a bunch of terrorists, and everybody kind of maybe still gives a begrudging assent to that. But then if you challenge them and say, hey, look, if we withdraw, are you ready to watch the undoing of human rights in Afghanistan? Are you ready to watch the bloodbath? It will happen in the aftermath. The unraveling of women's rights in Afghanistan. Are you prepared to watch what is going to happen to Afghan women? That's when people start to get really, I feel, uncomfortable with the idea of leaving Afghanistan. They understand, I think there's a kind of an intuition, almost a moral intuition, that our intervention there has achieved some moral good and should achieve some moral good. I just want to say there's a connection there between the moral good and our strategic aims. It is precisely in building and fostering a just and lasting peace that we also address the root causes from which terrorism grows. So we don't have to choose either or, it's both and.
The questions are rolling in now. One aspect of just war is last resort. Do you see any other actions that can or should be taken first to address terrorism before we utilize military force?
I mean, in theory, yes, it's tricky because with terrorism, you hardly recognize that it's there until they have struck and already initiated hostilities. And once they have, it may be too late to do anything else. However, let me immediately backtrack and say that in combating terrorism, I think it's important, while some kinetic activity may be necessary to kill and capture leaders abroad or at home, I think you always do want to ask yourselves, where did this terrorism come from? Why is it here? Some of y'all might be a little uncomfortable with that, thinking that I'm starting to justify or sympathize or empathize with the terrorists or something like that. It's not quite that. It's that I want to make sure I understand what pathologies gave rise to this terrorism in the first place. And I think it's fair to say it's always the case that you'll find some social, cultural, economic condition that you need to redress in the course of addressing terrorism more broadly. This is a long way of saying that we do need to do more than just kill and capture to address terrorism. It may not be possible to do that preventatively because, again, you don't know terrorism is a problem until they've already struck, and then you're already in the midst of it. I wish we could. If we can, of course we should, but oftentimes you're doing it simultaneously with kill and capture, not beforehand.
What would you argue is the proper way to build a nation? Bush argued that we would create a sea of democracies, in quotes, but we haven't been able to do that as of yet because of corruption and other factors.
For that, I would say, see my first book, Armed State Building. That's my first book is entirely on how to go about armed state building under conditions of military conflict. And my answer is, it depends. it depends upon the conditions on the ground, because some states need some things, some states need other things. I think we're very wrong to try a cookie cutter approach to any state building. And sometimes we're drawn to the latest fad in reconstruction operations. One fad was security first. We just need to blanket the place with troops and lock it down so that nobody can move, and then we can declare victory. The problem with that is it turns out to be security only, and you build authoritarian regimes, and that's not true just peace. Another fad was institutions first. Build civil society, build bureaucracies. All right, and the problem with that is you sometimes can't do that if people are still shooting at you. You do need security to build institutions. Yet another fad was democracy first, right? Hold elections and the rest will follow. We all know that doesn't work for lots of different reasons. So you really have to look at the ground to figure out where the biggest failures are and where to put the priority of effort. I think, to use Eric Patterson's work again, he talks about the priorities of order, justice, conciliation. I think it's a rough and ready, pretty good framework. I'm just a tiny bit hesitant to endorse order first, because in practice, it so often turns out to be order only. And I know that's a problem we often make, and we shouldn't do that. But so long as we understand it's not just order, I'm comfortable saying order, then justice, then conciliation is a fairly decent way of approaching these things, with an allowance that we should always adjust as needed as conditions dictate.
Could the U.S. justly intervene in a place like Nigeria, where a rogue element is doing great harm to the Nigerian people, but the government seems unwilling to protect their own people?
So in my book, I address the broader war on terror, or I would call it the war on Al-Qaeda, outside of Iraq and Afghanistan. These are places where we've intervened through surgical strikes and or special forces to do sort of punitive raids. The question I ask is, how can this be done justly? I certainly don't want to argue that every single place we ever drop a bomb, we have to rebuild that country. Don't hear me saying that. I think our responsibility is proportionate to our involvement. So if we're doing a punitive raid, that does not obligate us to rebuild the country, but I think it does mean we should ensure that whatever we're doing in that country is at least moving the country in the right direction, not the wrong direction, towards more justice and peace, and not away from justice and peace. You asked about Nigeria, but let me say about Libya. We intervened ostensibly to stop a humanitarian crisis, a genocide, but I think our intervention there actually caused more disorder and less justice and less peace. Libya today is a failed state, and it's a terrorist recruiting playground. Our intervention there achieved the opposite of what it should have achieved. There is no justice and there's no peace in Libya. That's a great example of how not to do things. Could we, in principle, intervene in a surgical way, in a way that also avoids sort of creating state failure? I think yes. The answer is yes. I don't know enough about Nigeria to say how we would do it there. From my limited knowledge, I think that the Horn of Africa may be a good example of where we've done it right. There's been some American military presence there in a very light way that has helped prevent al-Shabaab and its sort of successor groups from taking power or returning to power. And that's probably a good thing. Maybe we could do more, but it's also not the most important region of the world to U.S. interests. So that might be a good example of where we've done it right.
This next question is from Joe Chapa. Excellent work, Paul. Thank you for the talk. I wonder, on your view, about the scope of a state's responsibility for order and justice in other states. I can see how after 9/11, the U.S. was committed to war in Afghanistan. The U.S. might have obligations to pursue order and justice in Afghanistan and for the Afghans. But does your view entail that every state has obligations to use force to pursue order and justice in every other state? How, on your view, should we bound the scope of those responsibilities? Thank you.
Yeah, learning how to, as you say, bound the scope is one of the hardest problems I face in the book, and I address it at considerable length in some of the later chapters. One of the better analogies I could find is Good Samaritan laws. Domestically, if you come upon a car accident, you're not obligated to help. In almost every country in the world, you're not obligated to help. You are obligated to call for aid. Just so you know, most laws, most states, most governments obligate you to call for aid if you come across somebody who's in a burning building or a car wreck. So that's number one. I think we should always raise awareness of crises and oppression and tyranny in the world. That's a good thing. We should do it. I think we're obligated to do it. If you choose to get involved, you have some obligations. The laws typically protect you from liability for any good faith effort to help the person in the car wreck. And so I think we should give some a presumption of goodwill to interveners that we want to actually help and do the right thing, as we, I think, were in Afghanistan in the early years. However, you're also obligated to stick around until it becomes too unsafe at the site of the car wreck, or you're obligated to stick around until the ambulance arrives. Okay, the problem is there's no ambulance in the international scene. So if we choose to intervene, we are acting as the first responder, and we are also volunteering to be the surgeon, to be there until the patient is stabilized. This is what I think we did not do in Iraq, right? We palpably, obviously left before the patient was stabilized. We helped Iraq, and in my book, I argue that we did have just cause to go to war in Iraq, and then we unjustly waged war there through a variety of bad tactics, and then we unjustly left. And I think the war in Iraq was, in effect, unjust because of that. So learning how to limit our obligations here. Again, we don't have to volunteer to get involved anywhere in the world. But if we do volunteer, I think we have to realize that comes with responsibilities. Last thing on this, these Good Samaritan laws also impose obligations in certain conditions. Spouses are legally obligated to help each other in a car wreck. Parents are legally obligated to help their children. Employers, interestingly, are almost always legally obligated to help their employees. So there's these conditions where there's a recognized relationship that imposes obligations. Is there an analogy in the international system? Yeah, I think between allies, there's an obligation. If you signed a treaty, you have to obey that treaty. We have signed 4 or 5 documents with the government of Afghanistan. A strategic partnership agreement in 2005, another one in 2012, a bilateral security agreement in 2013. We have promised again and again and again in writing that we will stand by them for their security, their prosperity, and their justice. And if that paper means nothing, we should go home and never aspire to any moral aspiration ever again, because our word means nothing. So there are obligations in certain conditions of special relationship. I think we have that special relationship with Afghanistan.
What are the winning strategies for A, generating the necessary public will, and B, eventually building a sustainable Afghanistan?
Anything, we've had 4 presidents oversee this conflict, and I would greatly fault both President Obama and President Trump for never even trying to generate the public will. It was remarkable to me that President Obama, in 8 years, almost never gave a speech on Afghanistan, and when he did, it was always a speech about withdrawing from Afghanistan. I think President Obama very much led public opinion about getting out of that war. He campaigned on winning that war, and as soon as he got elected, he started talking about leaving that war. He never tried to rally public support behind it. President Trump did something very similar. Again, 2017, he talked about trying to win the war, quickly gave up on that, and then he also spent the rest of his presidency trying to withdraw. So, your question is, how do we get up the political will? Well, try at least. I don't know how to say it. Like, we only have negative examples of presidents not trying. I think President Bush did try before he started the war in Iraq, right? So I think in 2001 and 2 and maybe a bit of 3, he tried. And we'll see what President Biden does. I actually don't know where they're going to come out on this. And what was the second part of that question? How do we rebuild Afghanistan? Look, I don't know if we have the opportunity to anymore. The window of opportunity to do the most good was 2001 through 5, when there really wasn't a war, maybe 2002 through 5, after the Taliban fell from power, before the insurgency started. That's when we could have and should have really rebuilt Afghanistan. I don't know that we have the opportunity to do that anymore, because the situation has changed so much. And yes, our political will's gone. I would like to see a kind of a new assessment, a new strategy review, It would not require 100,000 troops because there's a lot more Afghan troops in the fight now. I think it requires probably more troops than we've got now, but a lot more money and a lot more patience and a lot more willingness to kind of see it through to the end, which we'll see. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure who has that patience and will right now.
This next question is from one of my students, Micah Pepper. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Miller. My question is on the historical shift on just war theory. You mentioned that more just war theories use Hobbes's philosophical framework rather than Augustine's framework. Since Hobbes's idea revolved around self-preservation above all else, how did modern just war theorists still affirm several self-restricting criteria rather than embracing realist ideals, which would seemingly offer a better chance at self-preservation?
So I don't think they did. And to be clear, when I say modern, I'm talking about essentially pre-20th century. I'm talking about 17th through 20th century thinkers. So Samuel Pufendorf and Christian von Wolff and Meredith Vittel and Thomas Hobbes. I don't think they Pufendorf even has a line in there about how limits in war are immoral because they limit your ability to do what you want to do. I'm misquoting here, but he actually has a line in there about how we should not have any limits in war. So I think it's pretty clear in the Westphalian tradition, there's a tendency to pull away from any limits. This is also the era of, I think they're called the Sovereigns' Wars, where kings asserted the right to declare war for no other reason that they declared war. For them, their wars were self-justifying because they declared them. This was the high point of absolutism. It was also the dawn of realism. I kind of think that the Westphalian tradition fits hand in glove with realism. I someday want to write a history of realism and how it's not realistic. So I think I may disagree with the premise of the question here. I think these thinkers actually opened the door for limitless warfare, which is precisely when we saw the era of total war open up with Napoleon and find its zenith in World War II.
Do you believe that from a distance we can see the difference between going to war for reasons pertaining to human rights versus the rights of the state or country? Or is this only possible to realize the answer after it is too late to stop the war?
Well, I want to make sure I say that it's not necessarily wrong to go to war for the rights of your state or country, right? I think that is a just cause for war, is to defend yourself and to go to war for your own rights. So it's not as if these things are opposed. It's that the Westphalians thought that wars for your own state's rights was the exclusive reason to go to war. And that within that reason, that justified any kind of war for any reason because the state says so. The defense of the state became the power of the state, which became a rationale to wage war for any particular reason. So they both can be just, and they often are. In many wars, there's a mix of reasons, a mix of causes. In the war in Iraq, I think there were some humanitarian reasons there. Saddam Hussein was a totalitarian tyrant who brutalized his people for decades and committed massacres and imposed one of the worst tyrannies on the planet. Ending that was just. There was also some strategic considerations about weapons of mass destruction that we genuinely believe were there but weren't. And so these dovetailed, or they overlapped. It wasn't either or. I think there's rarely a case where it's one or the other, sort of strategic considerations or pure humanitarian considerations. Libya actually might be a good case of a purely humanitarian intervention for the United States. The Europeans had some strategic considerations there. But again, you don't have to pick either or. It can be both and.
This next question is from one of my colleagues, Dr. Michael McCoy. Reinhold Niebuhr identified himself as an Augustinian realist. What do you consider the qualitative difference, if any, between an Augustinian liberal and an Augustinian realist?
Yeah, so Niebuhr is all over my second book on American Power and Liberal Order, and I used him as a kind of I leaned on him as a pillar for my argument about American grand strategy. I think they might be two words for the same thing, or they overlap so strongly as to be indistinguishable, at least the way I'm using them. Some people may nitpick this or that, but when I talk about Augustinian Liberalism, I'm trying to get at a version of classical liberalism that is humbled and chastened by an Augustinian appreciation of human nature, which is pretty much what Christian realism is. Christian realism is an attempt to be realistic about the world as it is, and yet infuse it perhaps with some Christian hope and Christian responsibility. You understand that both of these things, uh, pure realism is too cynical and amoral, and pure utopianism or idealism is dangerous in its crusading zeal. And so we want the middle way that combines a Christian hope, Christian responsibility with a Christian understanding of human nature. And that's what we're looking for.
This next question is from David Baer. You talked about sovereignty as central concept of the just war tradition, yet sovereignty suggests the supreme and exclusive political power within a territorial region. In that respect, it seems a quintessentially liberal concept. I wonder if you might discuss how the concept of sovereignty functioned in pre-Westphalian and medieval periods. Charlemagne had a kingdom or empire which became contested among his grandchildren and evolved into different kingdoms. The Holy Roman Empire itself evolved into a complex mixed monarchy with political authority shared by kings, electors, princes, etc., that never had fixed boundaries. Did it mean to talk about sovereignty in this pre-modern context? In other words, could you defend your thesis that sovereignty is central to the just war tradition? I'd be inclined to argue that it wasn't dominant in the just war tradition until after Bowdoin and Hobbes.
I suspect we are maybe agreeing more than not, because what you're describing is that sovereignty in the pre-modern, pre-Westphalian era was overlapping. The lines were blurry. There were multiple authorities that perhaps could act to check and balance each other and keep one another accountable. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. That sovereignty in the pre-Westphalian era was the emphasis of that concept was on responsibility, not on autonomy. What the Westphalians did is they looked at that concept and they really changed it so that I think it sort of got emptied of its accountability content, and they emphasized exclusively that sovereignty means autonomy, non-interference, and ultimate power within your borders. It's a very different kind of sovereignty than what you, I think, rightly describe as obtaining in the pre-Westphalian world. As for how important the concept is in just war thought, I guess I don't have a thought on that. I'm not making an argument about how essential it is, but rather how it functioned.
Got a question from one of my current students, Brett Bauman. What happens when we are faced with clear affronts to justice and peace, such as the Uyghur genocide in China, but military intervention would cause a conflict that might result in massive human suffering?
Yeah. No, this goes back to the question about boundary drawing and how do you limit your responsibilities. I think we are absolutely responsible for raising awareness about this. I think if we turn a blind eye or pretend it's not happening or lie about it or spin about it, I think that's immoral. That doesn't mean we must invade China to, save the Uyghurs. That would cause World War III and kill hundreds of millions of people, and we shouldn't do that. That's, I think, a pretty clear and obvious calculus. So our responsibility is limited by our power, by our realistic, what can be realistically achieved. If you simply cannot achieve something, you're not responsible for doing it or not doing it. You can't commit a sin of omission for something you don't have the ability to do. We don't have the ability to force China to stop doing what it's doing. We just don't. We could reevaluate our trading arrangements with China. I think we can, perhaps we should. And we could reevaluate a number of things in our relationship with China, but let's not pretend that we are omnipotent and capable of decreeing overnight that they will stop violating human rights. We can't. We can and should raise awareness, name and shame, call them out, condemn them at the UN, and again, maybe reevaluate our trading relationship with them. But that's about the limit of what we can do, and therefore the limit of what we're responsible for. This is something I run across with my students. There tends to be an assumption that America is omnipotent, that if there's a bad thing in the world, we can be the ones to solve it. I'd love for that to be true. It is often true that the United States is the preeminent actor and therefore the coalition organizer that organizes nations for a common purpose. That is often true. But that is very different from saying we can and therefore must solve all problems. We just can't.
I'd like to ask a personal question related to the genocide in Rwanda. Was there a good just war theory supporting U.S. military intervention to stop the genocide then?
Yes, I think a good just war argument. Yes, as I kind of outlined earlier, I think humanitarian intervention is squarely within the Augustinian framework and the liberal framework. So I fully endorse the principle of humanitarian intervention. In that particular case, what I'd want to see is, was there a plan, an achievable, practical plan that could have stopped the violence quickly enough? I'm not even going to say at reasonable cost, because that's actually not my first question. It's, could it be done? I don't think I know enough of the specifics of that case to know if that's true. Once again, many people assume that the United States is actually more capable than it is, particularly when it comes to the American military. And they think, well, we could just go anywhere, do anything. I don't know that that's true. So show me a case study that says we could have sent X troops here to do that, and it would have stopped the violence. And if you can show me that, then I'm all for it. I think we could have done it. I know that Samantha Powers has made the argument that we could have. So look for her argument if you want the best argument in favor of that.
So this next question is from one of my faculty colleagues, Dr. Alex Haskins, who asks, do we need to grapple with the U.S.'s history of imperialism across the globe in order to argue for the U.S. pushing for an ordered Augustinian liberty?
Yes, we do. And that's a very good Niebuhrian question. And I have a lot to say about this, and we're out of time. Our estimation of American virtue is highly colored by our social location in America. And what I have found is that Americans who are highly educated in positions of power and prestige, or who have more markers of privilege, tend to be less aware or less concerned with America's past sins, including its sins of imperialism. And perhaps the people in that category maybe need to dwell a bit more on the history of American imperialism. There is another crowd I have found that does the opposite, that tends to perhaps overplay American vice and overplay the bad things we've done. And actually, I think oftentimes gets the history wrong, right? They start talking about like, oh, we overthrew the government of Chile. We actually didn't, right? Spoiler, we didn't. And I'll talk to you till I'm blue in the face about how that's a myth. That didn't happen. The United States was not behind that particular coup. So what I'm saying is, once again, let's find the middle way where we do have an appreciation for the ways in which we ourselves are sinful. We ourselves are prone to exaggerate our own virtue. And therefore we should be cautious. And that's why multilateralism is a good thing. We should go in consultation with our allies, not all our allies, not Saudi Arabia, but with our liberal democratic allies, to consult with them before we embark upon an intervention. But let's not fall into the crime of moral paralysis. Because if we don't, I almost certainly can guarantee you that no one will. And if you want to see bad things ended, if you want to see human suffering ameliorated, it will have to be us playing a role in resolving that conflict. Doesn't mean unilaterally, doesn't mean exclusively, but almost certainly the United States will have to play a role, because we still have that unique position in the international system by virtue of our power, our networks, our path dependency, our historical role. It is still absolutely true that American power and liberal order are mutually constitutive. And if you want to defend one, you have to rely upon the other.
Well, time is unfortunately up. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for taking the time with us. We hope that this is a beta test. This is our first colloquium, and we're hopeful we're able to do this live in the future. So thank you, and the participants and presenters earlier today for making this, I believe, to be just a successful colloquium. So